So the essential teaching of the Buddha is easy enough to summarize. It's a lot harder to unpack, and of course it's even more difficult to internalize and to follow. So just to begin with the summary, the Buddha is known for 4 noble truths. The first noble truth is that life is suffering. The second noble truth is that there is the origin of suffering. The third is that there is the cessation of suffering. And the fourth is that there is a way or a path to the cessation of suffering, the so-called Eightfold Path, or the way of the Buddha towards happiness, towards Nirvana. Now, most of the Buddha's practical teaching centers upon the distinct elements of the Eightfold Path, all of which are designed to discipline the mind, to discipline the body, so that one's thought and one's conduct are directed towards the kind of compassionate life and the disinterested love that Buddhism is known for. What I want to do is I want to zoom out first, and I want to look at the overall philosophical framework within which this Eightfold Path is presented. So let's go back then to the first noble truth. Life is suffering. Sounds fairly pessimistic, sounds pretty dour. What's he mean by that? Well, the term that is translated suffering here carries a very wide range of connotations. It does include what we think of when we hear the word suffering. It does include psychological, physical, pain, anguish, and the like. So far forth, even that contains an element of truth. I mean, all throughout history, the poets, the philosophers, and common people have attested to the fact that no one is exempt from suffering. We all experience hardships. We all eventually will die, and so forth. So that's included in the first noble truth, that life is suffering. But it's not all there is to it, and it's not even the most philosophically interesting part. The word dukkha, translated suffering, includes more than simply physical or psychological pain. It connotes the ideas or the notions of impermanence, of imperfection, of transitoriness. It connotes the idea that we are in some way or other out of joint with reality. You know, even when you're experiencing happiness, even when your life is going pretty well, even in those situations, you have an implicit knowledge or awareness that these things won't last. All good things come to an end. So to the extent that you cling on to whatever is causing happiness to you in that moment, that happiness you experience is diluted by a kind of anxiety, which comes with the knowledge that it's impermanent, that it'll end. Now, so far forth, all of this should sound fairly familiar and indeed acceptable from a Hindu point of view. Remember, he does take over this Hindu outlook concerning samsara, karma, and rebirth. And samsara is this great process of vicissitudes, ups and downs, impermanence, and the like. So how is the Buddha striking out on his own? How is he saying anything really different here? Well, according to one extremely important school of Hinduism, Advaita Vedanta Hinduism, the way that you can become liberated from or exempted from this never-ending process of samsara is to recognize that the impermanence that you're experiencing is in some way illusory, and that you yourself, your essential soul, is in fact identifiable with the divine, with the eternal, with the permanent, with the unchanging. So you, or your Atman, or soul, is identifiable with Brahman, with the divine. So not only on this Hindu picture do we have a soul theory or a self theory, but you have a kind of soul theory on steroids. Your soul is in fact as permanent and unchanging and eternal as God himself. For the Buddha, this is the crux of the issue. For the Buddha, it's this drive to identify yourself or your soul with something unchanging, eternal, permanent, that actually leads to the suffering that you experience in life. It's this belief in a self or soul which leads to all manner of selfish desires, selfish cravings, or thirsts, which in turn lead to the sorts of negative or vicious characteristics that can mark the individual human person. Ambition, pride, avarice, conceit, greed, and a discounting of the other person in favor of what is good for you. So on the Buddha's picture, not only do we not possess this eternal, permanent self, not only is it not to be identified with anything divine, we don't have a self to speak of at all. This is the so-called anatta, or no self theory or doctrine of the Buddha. And I think it's crucial to a right understanding of Buddhism and even the first noble truth. So think about the matter like this. Consider a flame burning on the wick of a candle. It makes enough sense to talk about it being the same flame, burning on the wick of the candle all day long, unless maybe somebody blows it out and relights it. In that case, you might want to say, it's a different flame. But strictly speaking, from moment to moment, all it is, it's a bundle of molecules, ever-changing from moment to moment. We call it the same flame in a courtesy or loose sense, but there's nothing about that flame that stays the same from moment to moment. The same is true of a river, for example. You can ask sensibly questions like, are we going fishing in the same river that we went fishing in last summer? But at the same time, there's nothing from moment to moment that stays the same about the river. It's an ever-flowing stream of water molecules, changing again and again over time. So in this loose sense, yes, you can step into the same river twice, but in a strict philosophical sense, you can't, because there's nothing the same about that river from moment to moment. So according to the Buddha, we ourselves are like the flame. We're like the river. Human beings are composed of a set or a series of mental and of physical aggregates that go together to make us up. What that means is that we're a bundle of events going forward, but like the river, like the flame, there's no unchanging substance or substratum underlying all of these changing events. It's crucial to Buddhism that you internalize this truth. It's crucial to Buddhism that you recognize that there's nothing permanent about yourselves. Again, all of these truths hang together in a particular way. So you recognize the theory of conditioned genesis or conditioned states, which says basically all things, including yourselves, it's an interrelation of causes and effects going on in this related web. And there's nothing permanent underlying any of them. That enables you to recognize that the belief that you have that you are some unchanging, abiding thing is an illusory belief. It also enables you to recognize, as the second noble truth says, that the cause of suffering is this unfounded and illusory, deceptive belief in the self. So what you've got a diagnosis of your problem. Life is suffering. And this suffering is caused by the kind of selfish craving or thirst that arises from a faulty belief in a permanent self. The prognosis is that your condition is curable. There is such a thing as the cessation of suffering. And that's going to involve extinguishing the belief, the faulty belief in a permanent self. The Eightfold Path, or the way of the Buddha towards nirvana and to enlightenment, requires that you extinguish this belief through a series of actions and right-minded thoughts that enable you to extract yourself from this faulty view of reality. So you can see now how the Four Noble Truths of the Buddha all hang together with one another. The first noble truth, that life is suffering, indicates impermanence and indicates, moreover, that you don't have an abiding permanent self. The second noble truth shows where the the selfish craving and desire comes from, the selfish craving and desire that leads to your suffering. It comes from this false idea of the self. So you've got a diagnosis of your problem, and now you've got a prognosis. The Third Noble Truth says that this is curable, right? Suffering can be made to cease. And the way forward, the prescription that the Buddha gives, is by following the middle way, the Eightfold Path. Now, again, the Eightfold Path is sometimes referred to as the middle way because the Buddha sees it as occupying a middle position between two equally wrong-headed extremes. On the one hand, there is the attempt to find happiness and satisfaction simply through sensual pleasures. On the other side of the ledger, you have the attempt to find happiness, enlightenment, by way of these sort of life-denying, austere, ascetic practices. The Buddha says, no, both of those extremes need to be avoided, and you should follow this path, which is again geared towards the disciplining of the mind and of the body, focused towards the compassionate life of the Buddha. Where does this lead then? I've said a couple times it leads to nirvana. You might want to know what that is. What is nirvana? I don't know. More than once the Buddha was asked what nirvana is and whether the person who achieves nirvana lives on or whether they simply cease to be. What's their status? Well, the word itself means extinguishing or blowing out. So it looks as though you're simply looking forward to non-existence, not coming back to samsara and not being anymore at all. But again and again, the Buddha would say, well, the person who has achieved nirvana doesn't exist, but doesn't not exist. So the idea is that it is something which is beyond the categories of being and non-being. We do know, at the very least, it's a form of being to the extent that it is, that doesn't involve imperfection, out of jointness, suffering, or anything of that sort.